Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome my guests, panelists from Canada. Welcome, Wally Klinck.
Hi, Arnie. How are you?
I'm well, thank
It's
you.
pretty nice here, but we're getting a little bit of rain. It's a little bit cool.
Okay, yeah. So your cool is what?
Oh, I think it's probably around 18 or so. I don't know.
Okay,
15 to 18.
we're in the middle of winter, and we're about 18. So it's certainly a little bit different. A
Nothing to
different.
complain about.
No, not to your summer. Our winter, your summer. So there you go. Welcome, Robert Klinck from Canada. Welcome.
Good to be here again, Arnie.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Okay, I'm going to just cut across to a website, and I happen to have it shown to me this morning. IMF, the International Monetary Fund, urges Canada not to change its policy despite calls to ease the mortgage stress test. Now, this is to do with housing, and this is to do with financial policy being suggested, or if you like, recommended by the different international banks over the government of Canada. Now, I think that's most important because in our discussions, we will always highlight that there are different powers in the world that be, and that what we are looking at when we look at our, if you like, our regional or state governments, um, and then we look at our federal governments, and over and above these, we think they're the highest power there is, but there's not. The highest power is actually the power of finance. And finance influences mainstream media to the point where they can actually totally control government because mainstream media can create or destroy any individual just through slander, through whatever. And they do. Anytime you see a hatchet job on politicians or industrial leaders or whatever, they've obviously stepped out of the box. And so finance controls the media, media controls the government, not the people. Anyway, we'll open the floor for discussion. Your thoughts, Robert?
Well, it's an international organization that it's sticking its nose into the national affairs of Canada, and the heading would suggest that it's trying to incite the Canadian government to keep things a little bit tougher for Canadians to get mortgages. And really, is it any of their business? And why doesn't the Canadian government just tell them to go take a flying leap,
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm sure the Canadian government is paying a lot of attention to anything the International Monetary Fund is telling them.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's fascinating. That there it is, right in front of in front of your eyes, that the financial powers are dictating. Now, in the Australian Constitution, we have the capacity. Even the states have the capacity to run their own banks and have their own banks. And in the last 20 or so years, I've found that all the state banks in Australia like your provinces, the state banks in Australia have actually been shut down and merged within four major banks in Australia. And so you've got essentially a monopoly of banking interests. And I've made it my business to actually chase the principal shareholders in these four major banks. And the actual spread of shares is consistent. And that is I think it's a Hong Kong HSBC, I think it's called. It's essentially the parent bank of the City of London owns the lion's share, a dominating influence share. It's not like 51%, it's smaller than that. But when you consider that how many shares you need in order to actually have significant influence and be present on the board, and then the other two major shareholders are American banking interests. And so they really do dominate financial policy in Australia, as is the case in Canada. Your thoughts, Wally Klinck?
Well, it's a supranational power that overrides the affairs of nations. It makes a mockery out of national sovereignty, and it makes a mockery out of individual freedom. Canada is a vast country. We have resources that could provide homes over and over and over again for all of our people. And we have the technology and we have the ability to use those resources. And it is entirely outrageous that some external power should actually dictate the degree to which we provide housing for our people.
Yeah, no, that's a beautifully illustrated description of what's actually going on. And the fact is that the national debt of all nations is going through the roof. And when you consider that the financial system is actually a man-made system, and the books could easily be balanced if the system was a correct reflection of what was actually transposing into the economic system. What was actually being done, the books should be balanced. And that is that when a house is built, the real cost is already paid. The real cost in material and services, labour, technology is already paid when the house is completed. And yet the financial system, a man-made system, over and above governments, is imposed on it. It's reflected as a debt, and the debt goes on for generations. In Australia, it's to the point where the mortgages for young people now $3, $4, $500,000, and the average income 50 or 60. Once they start saving, it will take generations to pay this off if they ever will pay it off.
And
Robert,
it takes a big portion of their income just to cover the cost of living aside
that's
from
right.
that.
That's what I mean. The savings that actually can go towards mortgage, it takes such the lion's share out, and it impoverishes nations. It impoverishes the people. And okay, we talk about housing. It's no different with government and the loans issued to government in order to bring about infrastructure. And those loans are indebtedness go across generations. Well, Robert Klinck.
Well, it's something, is it not, that the government has the assumed authority to bring this obligation on the backs of people. Mm-hmm. And it surely is an odd situation when government is resorting to private institutions in order to finance its activities. Why in the world is the government going to these institutions instead of creating credit in circumstances that well, I'm not going to suggest now that government should be creating all credit, because government would be as dangerous a credit creator as the private banks are. If you're going to allow that, you're going to have the credit being created in accordance with some principles that prevent any centralized power from using the power of finance to expropriate the population and dominate its initiative.
That's exactly right. So finance essentially can be weaponized, and it is being weaponized. We're seeing that private institutions are essentially weaponizing it to control government, and through the mainstream media, they can create or destroy a government. Now, we've just been through a federal election, and it's fascinating because the amount of dollars allocated to advertising campaigns was unprecedented in Australian electoral history. And the objective was to reinstall the previous government. It was actually, and it achieved its objective. Even though they were significantly unpopular, the mainstream media campaigns were so, if you like, derogatory towards the opposition, polarizing essentially the electorate to the point where those that could be influenced by the mainstream media were, and directed their votes to hold on to the devil they knew rather than the unknown devil that was possibly before them. So they polarized the electorate. Mainstream media polarized it, and that to me was an outworking of finance. Wallace.
Mm-hmm. Well, just as an aside, more or less, in Canada, our government, our federal government, has begun to subsidize the media. Well, you know where that leads. They want a state media. They want a media that will get them reelected in the upcoming election and keep them there afterwards. I mean, it's just outrageous. It's blatant. But I was going to say, in the early days when people came to populate this abandoned land or this empty land, essentially, they built homes, they went into the forest, they cut down trees, they built log houses. Some of them are not too bad, actually. Not fairly nice homes. But did they go to a bank in order to get a mortgage? No, they went out and drew the resources that existed within nature. They built the structures, and the structures were paid for when they were finished. There was no mortgage binding them to slave for 50 years or 30 years or whatever the mortgage may be for into their future. They were free. They built a house and they were free to go about their lives and do other things. Now, as you know, I mean, in some countries, I think in Britain, they do have 50-year mortgages, I believe. And of course, it projects into a situation where your descendants won't have to pay your mortgage.
Yeah,
and as a matter of fact, they actually said that with regard to some student loans in the United States, that they wouldn't be paying for them completely, and their descendants would have to finish the payments.
It's incredible. To me, the word to describe it is predatory. Predatory, and I think that's a very, very important word, because it's not just the, if you like, the loan sharks coming in and promising the promised land if you go after this particular project. We saw that in the Economic Hitman when we read that book, and that's actually on the League website. I wouldn't give you much time. I think it was for the last 6 chapters, because I think he turns into a communist, but the fact is they're predatory, and that is they come in, they offer the promised land. If you do this new infrastructure, they'll finance it, they'll do the loans, and then when the promised land doesn't arrive, the government, in this case of different countries, is at the point of destitute. And so in that point of destitution, they continue to increase taxation in order to service the debts. Now let's just come back to square one. And that is within the Constitution, certainly within Australian Constitution, it has the capacity for all banking to be authorised through the federal government. It's actually a section in the Constitution. They're authorised to do it. Australia had a history of 12 years where it did have a People's Bank from 1912 to 1924. They financed the First World War effort. We came out of the First World War debt-free. They also financed the People's Bank financed significant infrastructure, east-west railway lines, which was thousands of kilometres, the Board of Works in Victoria, which was the essentially sewage and water, the Commonwealth steamships, the Commonwealth mills. I mean, it was a significant expansion of public works, and these were financed at very low interest, and if necessary, interest-free and debt-free. Now that was a People's Bank. And yet we see the loan sharks come in and do this to government, and then they are doing it on top of that to people. Now they're doing it to students, to the point where the indebtedness has entire communities, entire nations enslaved. Robert Klinck.
Well, they've got us into a position where the faster we run, the further behind we fall, it seems, with this financial system. And that runs counter to all the physical, technological developments that are going on in the world. So it's a tremendously anomalous situation. And, well, there has to be a better way, and there are probably quite a few better ways than what we've got now. There's probably a best way, and that is what we should be seeking. But there would be many ways in which to improve the way finance operates in society. Yet, do our politicians talk about this? No. They just let the financial system run according to the rules the financial system has invented for itself in order to claim the wealth of the population.
That's exactly right. I understand the other day from the World Debt Clock that the current debt owed to private institutions is essentially equivalent to 3 years of gross domestic product from all the nations in the world. So that means if we consumed nothing, but we continued to produce at our current exorbitant rates of production, we would clear the debt if we could sell to perhaps Mars or Jupiter or somewhere like that, and they would return the credits to us. If we handed 3 years worth of production of the entire world over to Mars or Jupiter, then the debt could be cancelled. But otherwise, the debt is irredeemable. Now, that's the position of madness, of insanity that we're in, indebtedness. And the fact is, it's a time of material abundance. If you look outside, you look at the natural world, you look at the rain, it continues to fall, the sunshine is there, the wind blows, the soil, if you look after it, it provides all the necessary foods requirements of life. It's all there. It's a world of abundance. And yet this man-made system, this tyrannical system, is there as has the whole world in debt to it, and it's privately owned. This is such an anomaly, a glaring anomaly, and industry leaders, political leaders, and dare I say it, religious leaders are mute. They sit on their hands and they say nothing about it. And yet, if you go to as was mentioned by the Pilgrims of St. Michael the other day, if you go to the encyclicals show that this is a tyranny and a great sin. Wallace.
Well, yes, the thing of it is we have this enormous debt that keeps building up, and we have to run faster and faster. We're enthralled to this debt. We're enslaved to this debt. And it also includes, the debt means that there's a concentration of holding the debt. The debt is not held by everybody around you as an ordinary citizen. It's the bigger you are, the more debt you hold. And of course, that gives the debt holders a great advantage over the average citizen, because the citizen has to pay taxes in order to finance the charges on this debt. And it means that you're enslaved increasingly to a more centralized pool of wealth holders. And we know from the statistics that wealth has been increasingly centralized and quite radically in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the centralizing and gathering, sort of a sweeping in of wealth and power, really. The power to command the services of your fellow man.
That's right. And,
which is not right. And
it is,
it's a very, very wrong, it's operating in the opposite way to which it should go. In a mass production system, producers cannot begin to consume what they produce. They have to dispose of it. They have to sell it. And if they can't sell it, if they do sell it, it's being dispersed in the community. But if it's being dispersed in the community only by the community having to go to the banks and become indebted in order to claim that wealth, then it's not really being dispersed. The actual physical wealth may be dispersed, but the finances are more and more concentrated. So you have to keep working harder and harder to service this abstract, hypothetical. It's not hypothetical because it's real, but it's not real in fact, in reality. It's just real in the fact that our institutions have been set up that way. The economy should not be run by the centralized setting of interest rates. That gives the banking system and the government the right to, well, manage the economy and micromanage the economy, in the sense that they control everybody's participation in the economy and their benefits from it. When I say micromanage, that's not quite right, because this gives them a way of macromanaging it in a way, because they can give a command to change the interest rates and affect the whole economy. But that's no good. They shouldn't be micromanaging it, and they shouldn't be macromanaging it. The economy should function by free people associating in such a way as to produce goods and services for each other. And you have to have a mass consumption system when you have a mass production system.
That's right.
And that means that somehow the surplus in the sense that it can't be bought because there isn't enough purchasing power to buy it. It's simply you're in a position where you can only get rid of the surplus by going into debt. Now, there's another way of doing it, and that's by giving it away.
That's right.
But that sends the financial system into paroxysms. They don't like that idea a bit, because there's nothing in it for them. But it would disperse wealth to the community. And every individual citizen, as a cell, a living organism of the community, would benefit and be helpful on that account. And that's what social credit, of course, aims to do. We want to affect a decentralization of wealth, but it's essential to get to the problem, to recognize that the problem is in the consumption, at the consumption stage of the economy. It's not at the production stage, because production will respond to demand.
That's
if
right.
the demand is there, production will respond.
Yeah. I think where you're going, Wally, and this is very important, is that you're actually going to highlight a change in policy. Now, currently in politics, we're always talking about administration. If we do this, they'll administer it better than the other, and they'll be better, and they're worse, and they're going to more spend, and all that sort of stuff. But what you're talking about, Wally, is a change in policy. And that is the policy being that we can actually have a financial system that reflects the abundance that's there and is not, if you like, effecting an imposition of debt over the whole world. A financial system that's held in equilibrium to the production system.
Mhm.
And that's a reflection, we call it distribution. The financial system having sufficient method of distribution so that it can actually alleviate the debt. It can actually liquidate the debt that's incurred as a consequence of production. That's a completely different perspective. And I find it fascinating that this predatory system that we've currently got, this predatory system that imposes debt over the whole world, essentially enslaves nation after nation to subject to their policy through control and manipulation of the mass media. This is predatory. And in order to undo it, we have to focus on policy. Policy being the elimination of debt, actually what would you call it, a sinking fund where debt is destroyed. Debt is actually redeemed. And then the productive system and the financial system or economic system reflect the natural reality of abundance. Robert.
Yes, well, they're always trying to fill this gap you've been talking about by means of increasing production. And of course, when you increase production, you end up distributing incomes in the course of that production. But you don't distribute incomes commensurate at all with the productivity that results from a concentration on constantly increasing production. So we have to get back to some thinking about fundamentals, I think, and we have to ask questions about whether a citizen has any ownership rights in the natural resources of the country, how you make such rights, if you recognize them, effective. You have to ask whether citizens have a relationship to the what we call the cultural heritage, which includes the accumulated technology and productive capacity of the economy. You have to ask fundamental questions like that. And I think you will come to a satisfactory conclusion about some of these matters if you concentrate on the issue of inheritance, because there is a vast accumulation of knowledge and capital and so on that exists in society generation to generation. And there should be a recognition of this, and there should be some kind of financial representation of it. As I mentioned in a previous talk, the Marxists, or Karl Marx in particular, in the Communist Manifesto in 1948, specified that communists object to any form of inheritance. But inheritance is the basis of our security. It must be. Otherwise, all we're doing, generation to generation, if there's no inheritance, is resetting society like some kind of a video game. And if you're always going back to your starting point, you're not going to progress very far. No. So we have to recognize that there is a cumulative wealth, and people have an entitlement to participate in it.
Yeah, I agree, Robert. And I think it's interesting you mentioned, or at least you inferred, security. And to me, personal security is a sufficiency of food, clothing, and shelter. That's security. And also the upholding of the law. the purpose of government is to uphold the law, not administer the law, uphold the law, so it's consistent across the community. And I find it fascinating. We look at our circumstances and we see actually the deconstruction of our culture and if you like, the undermining of the law. That some people are able to get away with the inordinate um, acts of, if you like, destruction in the community, towards the community, towards the cultural history, the cultural inheritance of the community. They're entitled to do it, and no one says boo. But if you object to it, then all the infrastructure of the law will come pouring down on you by the commissars in order to silence dissent. And that's not the function of government. The function of government is security and freedom. And this policy that we've been, if you like, espousing this morning is the policy of freedom. It's the policy of freedom. It's the actual outworking of our freedoms. And what we're demonstrating through the financial system and the predatory nature of it is the erosion of those freedoms to the point where you no longer are able to exercise any freedoms at all. Wallace.
Yeah.
No, and
I'll just add there, a lot of conservative thinking people put freedom and security in opposition to each other. And they argue that one is the enemy of the other. But of course, if you have no security, you have no freedom. So security is actually a strong basis of freedom.
And security worked to its nth degree is, well, put yourself in a high concentration prison and you've got all the security you want, but no freedom whatsoever. And so it's, to me, it's the balance of this freedom and security. And that is that you want to exercise as much freedom as is possible. But at the same time, the law needs to be upheld, your borders need to be manned, and your defence needs to be there. Your home needs to be secure. But it's for the function of freedom, for the exercise of those freedoms. Wallace Klinck.
Absolutely. Freedom is the key thing here. And any move toward a world government or a supranational government is definitely an imposition on people's freedom. Because the more you move the center of power over policy away from the locus of the community, the less the community has to say as to policy. And the individual is simply caught up in that. Now, when you buy a home, when they build a log home, you finish your home and then you were free to do what you wanted. You could do something else. You weren't bound to do something else before you could choose what you want to do with your life. Because today we have to go to work and produce something else to service this mortgage for years and years. Whereas in those days, the house was built and that was it. You were free to go out and go about your life and do other things. You can't do that today. You're bound by the debts you have. And by the debts they say that people have on their credit cards, it is really frightening. They're so loaded with debt that they have very, very little leeway. So there is, we're just literally enslaved, and people don't seem to realize that. I was just watching, what's her name? A young woman named Cortez. Do you remember her name?
The American Democrat.
Yeah, running for the presidency. And Prager University, a representative from Prager University, and they were debating the difference between the free market, the Prager representative, and this Cortez woman. She was presenting the case for social democracy. Well, you see, he's old enough. He was an older man. He's old enough to have seen the results of socialism. She is caught up, obviously, in an idealistic cloud. She doesn't understand the implications, the violation that socialism is upon productive and realistic associations, and how it suppresses creativity and reduces the productivity of human association. Whereas this other fellow from Prager, he's supporting the free market, but neither of them have the foggiest notion, the slightest realization or awareness of the role that finance plays in the whole thing. It's almost as though finance is just ignored as something that is neutral and is irrelevant. But finance is a control mechanism. It literally, you cannot do anything without money. It has to be issued for production. It has to be issued for consumption. Sure, you earn a portion of it, but increasingly you have to borrow in order to even obtain what's being produced.
Yeah.
And that means that you lose economic democracy in the sense that you really don't get a chance to choose as an individual citizen the overall policy of production, because you're forced to get a job, to get money, to service this debt, and you're not asked what has to be produced. You're given an ultimatum: get a job or lose what you have. And
That's right.
Participate in what we're offering you.
Yeah, yeah,
That's right.
and that I think I think that's fascinating, because it's in the end you can be producing battleships and guns and missiles in order to just service the mortgage that's on your home. And of course, what sort of madness is that? That you've got to produce missiles to be directed towards another country in order for you to put food on the table and pay your mortgage. That's the predatory nature. That's the end position of the financial system. That's where it ends up, this competition. And so the indebtedness of individuals vying for jobs, fighting over jobs, fighting over the crumbs that fall from the table, nations doing exactly the same thing, vying for markets so that they can liquidate their costs. And in the end, it becomes war, not just economic war, but in the end a hot war, in order to balance their books.
Yeah, the man from Prager University just assumes that if you have free markets, you will have a lot of economic activity and everybody's going to prosper. He's not taking into consideration the fact that human labor is being rapidly and massively replaced as a factor of production.
That's right.
What happens to the people who are being replaced? They either have no inheritance and they're cast off on the economic scrap heap of humanity, or they're going to have their rightful inheritance recognized, and that excess wealth that can't be distributed by wages, salaries, and dividends is going to be distributed by another matter and not by debt, because debt does not really distribute something in the genuine sense, because you now have to produce something else. You have to work for everything you get, even though machines and technology and robots are doing a major portion of it. Well, you can't pay money incomes to robots, but robots do enter into the cost of goods and services, and that expands your prices relative to your incomes, and you can enhance the incomes of the consumers by giving them lower prices and giving them a supplement to their incomes. You can pay the consumer. You can't pay a robot, but you can pay the consumer, and that's all that matters, because the end product is meant for the consumer. You don't produce for robots. They don't eat. They don't use these things.
Yeah.
And
to put the financial system in equilibrium. That's exactly right, Wallace. Exactly right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Closing comments, Robert Klinck.
Well, that's the nub of the problem, I guess. That's this ongoing gap, constantly growing gap between incomes being distributed to the members of the community and the prices that that community is being called upon to liquidate with their limited financial resources. And it is really quite astonishing that this issue is not addressed, because it's obviously a conundrum. Is it or is it not the case that people have sufficient income to buy their own production? I don't think this question is asked in university courses.
No.
There's this assumption that goes back to Say's law, that is that there's a liberation of enough purchasing power to buy production just by virtue of the productive activity. But that is an axiom that has no justification whatsoever. It requires examination. And when it has been examined, in particular by C.H. Douglas and his followers, it's been found that there's a great disparity between people's means of buying and what they're capable of producing. Obviously, there's no point in producing something that the community can't make use of. So this question has to be addressed, and the deficiency in the current situation corrected.
Excellently put, Robert. Excellent. That to me is a call for a change in policy, a change in financial policy that places the financial system in equilibrium with the production system. Wallace, Klinck, closing comments, please.
Yes, I mean, the thing of it is the deficiency of purchasing power is masked. It's masked by new money created by the banks as a debt against the community's wealth, not as new money created to just simply allow the consumption to take place and the money to go back to the producer and for him to pay his initial production loan off and have it canceled, as it should be. Because in the one case, it doesn't leave a trail of debt with debt-free money that is paid to the consumer. But if you allow the money to be accessed through debt, money borrowed or credit borrowed by the banks, it goes back to the production system and liquidates costs. But now it leaves a set of costs that have to be recovered out of future production. So it doesn't liquidate the costs. It merely defers them. And in the meantime, you are enslaved, and enslaved in a way that I think people don't even begin to realize.
And the banks are very happy with that situation because it enhances the demand for their product, which is money, because it's always an insufficient supply.
It's an ultimate expression of the will or implementation of the policy of the will to power.
That's exactly right. The will to power. We need a change in policy. This is Arnis Luks at the Freedom Forum. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Arnie.
Thank you.